Right. Thank you, Sri Angela. Thank you to the Central Tibetan Administration, Tibet Bureau, Geneva, and all the volunteers who made this two-day forum possible. And thank you to everyone here for your attention, solidarity, and support for Tibet. I would first like to begin by foregrounding the topic of this panel with the word transnational repression. Although the wider world is now becoming increasingly aware of China's coordinated and sophisticated systems of surveillance, censorship, and transnational repression, Tibetans have lived the combined effects of Chinese policies for decades. And nowhere has this been more visible than in Nepal, particularly over the last 2 decades, for Tibetans living in exile there who are stateless, they are refugees and without official documentation. Tibetans often refer to Nepal as the second Tibet. Even before the term transnational repression entered academic and policy discussions, Tibetans used this language by giving Nepal the name of their own country to refer to China's rule in Nepal, how China is watching, influencing, and effectively governing their shrinking political freedoms. And this is especially true for Tibetans living in limbo there and their children who cannot fully flourish there from their childhood to adulthood, and neither leave Nepal and nor fully embrace their youth and their creativity there. And Tibetans there cannot even openly receive or welcome His Holiness the Dalai Lama. One of the most striking examples of China's reach into Nepal occurred in 2019. Nepalese immigration officials detained, interrogated, and searched the Facebook content of a Tibetan American citizen who was deported back to New York. He was mistaken for Sikong Pembatsering because the name Pembatsering was blacklisted by Nepalese immigration authorities. So despite his repeated explanations that he is not the person that they think, he was deported after keeping him there for 6 hours. In an interview with Radio Free Asia, that Tibetan said, "The immigration officials ignored my repeated claims of not being the person they were looking for, and instead held me there for 6 hours at the airport, only to have me deported." Beyond such cases, cyber espionage targeting the Tibetan exile government, the Gandhi Podang Trust of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and Tibetan civil society organization has long seen China's growing and sophisticated reach of digital transnational repression in those days, explained mainly as cyber espionage. So what is now increasingly conceptualized as transnational repression in media, civil society reports, and international policy discussions over the last 5 years in particular, for Tibetans, it has long been a collective lived experience. And the most vulnerable are, even within the community, those in Nepal. And even amongst them, those with limited digital media literacy, those who rely heavily on social media for daily communication, phone payments, news and contact with family, friends, or those with sources inside Tibet. All of these experiences point to deeper underlying unresolved causes. Since the invasion of Tibet more than 7 decades ago, China's long-standing objective has been to erase the truth of Tibet's history, to isolate Tibetans from one another so that they cannot unite, mobilize, or reclaim their narrative, and to dismantle the agency of more than 100,000 Tibetans living in exile and across the diaspora in 27 countries. This is done with the intention to undermine also the democratic institutions of the Tibetan government in exile, as well as weakening the democracies of countries that support them. From my own experience in the last 5 years of trying to understand conditions inside Tibet, I have witnessed in my conversations with sources how they break down even before they can begin to speak. I've seen people cry, shrink in their own bodies, sweat, and go numb. They struggle to share even basic details that we as researchers have to answer to the mechanisms that are accountable for human rights standards. What happened, when, why, and so forth. Most of which they don't even have answers for. Many have no one they can fully confide in, even to express and share their pain. What they need is not only researchers or journalists, but sustained care, trust, and psychosocial support. Others have been forced to completely sever their ties with their families inside Tibet, or in some cases, family have cut ties with them to avoid punishment. Some have left research and journalism altogether. Others have prepared wills, received repeated death threats from phone numbers in multiple countries, or endured direct video calls from the public security bureau's officials, sometimes with their family members present on screen, and there are far worse cases. What is perhaps most haunting is the long-term impact, a lifetime of self-censorship and fear, and this fear is compounded by a deep sense of powerlessness and guilt over being unable to protect loved ones back inside Tibet, those living under China's rule, those imprisoned, and those especially connected to the 2008 uprising and the 159 self-immolations who continue to face even more systemic repression to this day. Fear in this context is not merely a survival instinct, it is an intentionally engineered social condition. It spreads from within Tibet through communication breakdowns and enforced distrust, amplified by China's securitization of society, Xi Jinping's unprecedented consolidation of power, and the integration of advanced technologies, big data surveillance. These include AI-driven systems that fuse facial recognition with internet browsing and app-based monitoring, national anti-fraud app, WeChat, Tenzin, and so forth, genomic surveillance, GIS, and tracking data. The emergence of predictive policing operating at speed and scale, which is a distinctly Chinese characteristic, signals a terrifying model of 21st century governance. It is a system that uses machine learning to prioritize state control over marginalized populations and to suppress their right to self-determination. I want to share one of the most heartbreaking interviews that Tibet Watch conducted in the last few years. It concerns a Tibetan village that was planned for relocation. Now, a father of three, Purba, who was living there, he was instructed by local party officials to hang a poster of CCP leaders in his home as a sign of gratitude ahead of the relocation. A devout Buddhist, he rejected the relocation. He refused to feign allegiance to the party, and what he did was, in private defiance, he threw the poster into the trash and burned it on the bank of a nearby river. Days later, police came. Six officers, led by a Han Chinese officer, beat Purba with fists, boots, and metal pipes. They lashed him with coiled wire and shocked him with a cattle prod. Between beatings, they interrogated him. They showed him two photographs. One was an image of His Holiness the Dalai Lama taken from Purba's home after his detention, and the other was a CCTV footage of Purba on the riverbank, bent over the burning poster of Mao Zedong and other CCP leaders. I want to now add the words of the police hurled at him as they were beating him, because these words, although phrased as questions, reveal the logic of the Chinese state. They were asking, "Why are you so grateful to the Dalai Lama? Does he even give you a mouthful of food? Why are you so ungrateful to Communist Party leaders? What are you doing to their portrait?" Gratitude and loyalty to the party state are demanded everywhere in Tibet, from classrooms to prisons, from propaganda billboards lining the streets, to the automatic questions uttered by professional torturers. This is the system Tibetans are living under today. Another example of China's attempt to coerce gratitude and loyalty demonstrates one of the most unprecedented cases of China's transnational repression on Tibetans. Last year, a prominent Tibetan Buddhist leader, Tulku Ringu, who went missing from Tibet after facing police interrogation for not providing a lavish reception to China's Panchen Lama Gyaltsen Norbu, was suddenly declared dead in Vietnam 6 months after his monastery in Tibet had been coerced and forbidden from making public any information about his sudden disappearance. Suspicion about joint operation between Chinese and Vietnamese state security circulated thereafter as 6 Chinese government officials accompanied 5 monks from Hongkar Rinpoche's monastery to Ho Chi Minh in early 2025. That was when those of us outside learned about Hongkar Rinpoche having died in late March 2025. These 5 monks were repeatedly coerced into signing documents certifying the death, and their phones were confiscated despite their appeals to be allowed to take photos of the remains for prayer offerings. The remains of Hongkar Rinpoche were later forcibly cremated despite international calls for independent investigations at a Buddhist center in the outskirts of Ho Chi Minh under the watch of around 70 Chinese and Vietnamese security personnel past midnight on 20th April 2025. Lastly, I want to conclude with the continuing fear of sources and eyewitnesses related to Hongkar Rinpoche, because to this day, we have not received any update about the 5 monks who were there at the time of cremation. This total absence of update is itself symptomatic of all the themes that we are discussing today. And lastly, I want to conclude with how China's attempt to replace the term Tibet with Xizang or other broad geographical, terms, just like how they are using broad terms to criminalize dissent, how these terms are creeping in official and diplomatic communications in foreign cultural institutions that nobody cannot overlook. This communication strategy of targeting national cultural institutions of other countries will distort and misinform general public who are new to Tibet. And this strategy is long known to long-time China observers as borrowing a boat to go out to the sea, where others' institutions are the sites of to infiltrate their own language and discourses. We have seen China use Xizang in place of Tibet at the UN. I've also read about groups of journalists on government-organized tours in Tibet having been instructed to use Xizang upon their landing in Lhasa. And foreign ministries, for example, Maldives, have once issued an official statement thanking China for their donation of water from Xizang Autonomous Region. It makes me think if we should anticipate a new experience of being corrected with Xizang every time we introduce Tibet or Tibetans. It used to be a common experience for Tibetans that when we talk about Tibet, we just straight out call how China has colonized Tibet, and it continues to remain under Chinese colonial rule. But now it makes me think if even our way of introducing Tibet and Tibetans would need this further element of saying that this will never be Xizang, if at all in the future that is what you are instructed to believe. I remember many years ago being put together with 4 international Chinese students during a team building exercise on my first day at the university. I explained to them at the end of our discussion that they can go introduce themselves to the class and that I will do mine myself. But one of the students who only knows the only story China tells about Tibet told the class that China has the biggest population of the world, including, she said, Tibet Autonomous Region. She didn't know, I realized. And only after 1 year, when we went for dinner, she asked why I grew up in India. And when I explained why, she said she had thought all along that the Dalai Lama went to India for pilgrimage. I wasn't expecting that. It was another peaceful narrative by 2 orders of magnitude. It had not stopped at peaceful liberation, it seems. So, prefacing any new introductions with cautions to not use Xizang in place of Tibet wherever possible, whenever possible, would be my first recommendations to everyone. And then whenever there is now official discussions about transnational repression, to look at what has been made possible even in exile by the successive generations of even stateless and refugee Tibetan communities would be a foundation to look at where the Western democracies have failed to look for so long, the loopholes that Tibetans have seen and documented. Yeah, thank you.